Okay. If you want to, you can turn in your Bible to Joshua chapter 2. Last week, we began taking a look at the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and which is found in Matthew chapter 1. And there were four names that just stood out in Jesus' genealogy, and that was the names of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and not necessarily a formal name, but the wife of Uriah. Four women's names. And we discussed how in Jewish genealogies, women were not included. And so we started to explore exactly why God would have these four women's name included. We're not talking about Sarah, we're not talking about Rebecca, we're not talking about Eve, but we're talking about Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And so what we did was take a look at these ladies' lives. And last week we talked about Tamar. We did a summary of her life and looked at some of the points in her life that God would want us to remember, to understand. And so we're going to continue that study. And tonight we're going to begin with Rahab, and hopefully we'll be able to finish this up. So we're not going to dive deep into their stories. We're going to kind of do a summary of their story and look at some of the key parts of information that can be applied to our lives and that God would want us to remember and to understand, because these women's names were in the genealogy of Jesus Christ for a reason. There's something here that He wants us to know. So the first one we're going to look at is Rahab. Her story is found in Joshua chapter 2 and in chapter 6. And it is another story of an unlikely person to be included into one's family tree. She was a prostitute, a common prostitute. And again, it is a story of God's grace and mercy. It shows that God can use the discards of this world in a great and mighty way if they will place their faith in Him. And like we said before, we're not limited by our past. We are limited by our faith. God can take all of us and use us in a mighty fashion if we will just trust Him and follow Him. So let's talk about Rahab for a minute. It's right here in Joshua chapter 2. The Jewish people, they're right there at Jordan. Joshua sends out two spies into the land of Jericho and tells them to look at all the land, and particularly the city of Jericho itself. You know, this is military recon, something I'm very familiar with. You're going out looking for, number of soldiers, the terrain, obstacles that may be in your way. Well, the spies, they go into the city of Jericho. And they make their way to Rahab's house. Now, you're asking yourself, why would the Jewish spies go to Rahab's house? Knowing that Rahab was a prostitute. And yes, there's been some people in the past tried to say Rahab was an innkeeper. They tried to sanitize, try to clean up what is written in the Bible. But we know in the Old Testament, tells us she was a harlot. The New Testament confirms it. The Hebrew word zuna means harlot. The Greek word for harlot is porne, where we get pornography, all of this. And those words don't mean innkeeper. They don't mean nothing else but a harlot, a common prostitute. That is what it means. One thing about the Bible, one thing about God and His holy words, he doesn't back down from the truth. He calls it what he calls it. He wants us to understand this. And that's one of the first lessons that we need to pull out of this, is the fact that we all liable to spend the rest of our life with the scars of our youth, of something in our past, that people will remember you. But it doesn't matter where you started, where you come from. It matters how you finish. Doesn't matter how the world looks at you. Only thing that matters is how God looks at you. So the spies go to Rahab's house. Seems strange. Why would they go there? Well, you take her occupation. Strange men coming and going would not really draw the attention to most people, would it? That's just part of the business. But the kings, there were people that were watching out for strange people coming into the city. They knew the Jews were across the River Jordan. They knew what was coming. They knew. And so they would have been on the lookout for any strange men, any people that didn't really belong there. So the spies would go to Rahab's house. Her house was on the wall, which would give them an extra way of escape. And the king learns about it. Somebody goes and tells the king. The king sends men to go get these two strangers, these two spies of Joshua's. And this is where Rahab really comes into the story. Because when the king's men come to her door, she basically lies to them. She says, oh, they're gone. The whole time she had hidden them on the roof of her house under a bunch of bundles of flax. She lied to the king's men and said, oh, they went out the gate about the time of dusk. She said, now you can search my house if you want to, but they're getting away. And so they take on off. There's a lot of people, scholars that will debate, was it right for her to lie? This is war. Deception is common in war. So you don't have to put any moral value on it. War's war, is it not? Because when I sat in the woods and I was all camouflaged and training and everything else, I was just trying to deceive the enemy into them thinking I was a bush. So basically I was lying to them. So I don't put any real high moral anything on this. She told them a lie. The moment that Rahab did that, she became a traitor to her own people. And if they had found out, not only would they have killed the spies, they more likely would have killed Rahab for treason, and the fact that there's a possibility even her family would have been killed by her act. Why would she do that? Why would she do that? And it all comes back down to verses 9 through 11 in chapter 2. Because that is her statement of faith. Her statement of faith, and we'll read it. And she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our heart melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. This is Rahab's statement of faith. When presented with this information, she believed. She believed in her statement right there at the end. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. The people of Jericho were pagans. They worshiped the Canaanite god. They worshiped the moon god. But Rahab turned her heart and acknowledged the one true God. She had faith. That is why she did what she did. It was an act of faith in God. Now, when she did that, she had no reassurances from the spies that when Israel come to Jericho, that she wouldn't be killed in the war. She placed her complete faith in God and God alone. That is where her faith was. Not in the promises of the two spies, but in God. And when we look at Rahab is mentioned in a very interesting place in Hebrews chapter 11. You know what Hebrews chapter 11 is? That's the hall of fame of faith. And Rahab is mentioned there because of her great faith. She's also mentioned in James, the book of James, chapter 2 and verse 25. And I'm going to read that one. It says, likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? Her works that she did, the protecting of the spies, did not earn her salvation. It was a result of her faith. That is what James is talking about here. That is what saved her, because in Hebrews 11:31, by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. It was her faith that saved her. And that is a great lesson for all of us. It's a lesson on faith. Not only does it not matter where we come from, the only thing that truly matters is our faith in God. And the fact that we see this woman who trusted God. And a lot of times in our own lives, we kind of sometimes struggle with that, do we not? We have events happen in our lives that kind of rock our world. And it kind of jiggles our faith, doesn't it? But it is through faith in which we carry on in spite of all that's going on. And in chapter 6, we know that the Jews come. They march around the city and the walls fall down. And the only ones that were saved was Rahab and her family. Now there is a lot in the story of Rahab. We could probably get 2 good sermons out of the story of Rahab. But we're just doing a highlight here. And the thing that stands out with Rahab, and the reason she is included in the genealogy of Jesus Christ is, here's another foreigner brought into Jesus' lineage. Jesus came for the entire world. This woman had great faith. We've talked about how people, when presented with the evidence, must make a choice. She was presented with the evidence that God was God, is who He says He is, the one true God, and she reacted by giving her faith over. And it wasn't just a little bit. She risked everything. Everything. She held nothing back. If she had been found out, she would have been killed. So when we put our lives in God's hand, it is complete. Every bit of it. Our entire lives. Okay. If I'm going to get through this, let's move on to Ruth. To do 3 biographies in one night is hard. Okay. If you want to look at the book of Ruth. Ruth, if there was one book in the Bible that should begin once upon a time and end with, and they lived happily ever after, it is the book of Ruth. I love the book of Ruth. It is a book that I have preached on before, did a series in another church a few years back on the book of Ruth. I love this story. It is a beautiful, beautiful story. Now, the main characters are Elimelech, Naomi, the husband, Naomi, the mother, Mahlon, and Chilion, the sons, Orpah, and Boaz, as well as Ruth. We know the story. There was famine in Israel. And so Elimelech takes his family and they go to Moab, to escape the famine. Now, while they're there, their two sons, they take wives of the Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. And as in any good fairy tale or any great story that begins once upon a time, there's always tragedy. Elimelech died, then the two sons died, and so there's Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, widows. And Naomi's in a strange land, away from her family, and is a widow, has no man to help take care of. And in today's society, women can get by just fine without a male. But in this society, they would pretty well be destitute, particularly in the pagan nations. And so, here's all this tragedy. So Naomi decides she's going back home. You know where home is? Bethlehem, a little place we know about, right? That's where her home is. And so she leaves. Her two daughter-in-laws go with her. And they get on down the road a little bit. Naomi starts thinking about it. And she tries to get her daughter-in-laws to go back home. Thought that their chances of, remarrying and living, happily ever after would be better if they stayed in their own homeland. Well, Orpah went home. She went back to her father's house. But Ruth stayed with her. And this is one of the things we love about Ruth. But you got to understand that Ruth, being married into this family, become exposed to God, the one true God. And one of the reasons that Ruth did not want to leave, she did not want to go back to the pagan rituals in which she was brought up in. She has been shown the one true living God, just like we have. How many of us want to go back and be like we were before we got saved? We don't, do we? Best decision I ever made in my life was Jesus Christ. I don't want to go back. That boy is dead. He's long gone. He's maybe not forgotten in history, but he's gone. Ruth did not want to go back. She wanted to go and continue to worship the one true God. And we know, so Ruth, just like Rahab, because of her faith, she gave up everything. Now when I got saved, I got saved and I went back to my daddy's house. Got baptized that morning, went back to my daddy's house. Really wasn't no great cost, to be honest. Just like most of us. You go off into a Middle Eastern Muslim country and you talk to a Christian there, for them to become a Christian, it costs them almost everything. But in the same, they gain everything more than what they ever lost. And so Ruth is a great story of the fact that although she had a pagan background, raised as a pagan, once she met the real God, the true God of Israel, she became a living testimony to Him by her faith. And it's a story we all know. Now, Ruth is also a great example of hard work, modesty, faithfulness. Oh, how faithful she was to her mother-in-law. I mean, to sacrifice, just leave her country, go with her, to follow her and the God of Israel, and was constantly thinking of her. Even when she got a meal, you know, you read in here, she would keep a little bit back so she could take it home to Naomi, kind of doggy bag it a little bit. If you've ever seen people from a foreign country sometimes who have really struggled for food, you'll see them all the time. They'll eat a little bit to get satisfied, but they'll save a little bit more to take back home with them because they were raised not sure whether or not they were going to get another meal that day. And we see the same thing right there in Ruth. I love it. It makes me want to cry sometimes. Just the humility of this young woman. And one of the lessons we learn from Ruth is the fact that faithfulness has its reward. God rewards faith. God rewards faithfulness. Because we all know what happened to Ruth, right? She got married to Boaz. She was King David's great-grandmother, or great-grandmother. She is mentioned in the lineage of Jesus Christ. She has her own book in the Bible. How great an honor is that? Yeah, here's a woman. And women weren't thought of very highly even in the Jewish culture. But yet there's a book named after her in the Bible that tells the story of this faithful, loving young woman who was a pagan, who was not born Jew, but brought into the family of God, just like we all are. Were we not strangers to God? Were we not enemies of God? But because of God's grace, God's love, we are now sons and daughters. We have been adopted, brought into God's family through our faith in Him. Ruth is also an example of how God can change a life and take it in a direction He has foreordained. We see Him working out His perfect plan in Ruth's life, just as He does with all His children. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose." Ruth is a beautiful story. And the man she married, Boaz, you know who his mother was? Rahab. Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful, is it not? And it is something that we need to be reminded of sometimes. And it is a wonderful story. Wow, I'm moving through this a little quicker than I thought I was, which is good. All right, the last woman that we're going to talk about is listed in Matthew chapter 1 as the wife of Uriah. And we know her proper name is Bathsheba. Now let's just go ahead and talk about the story. I mean, we've all been in church a long time. I don't have to go into all of these details. So we're going to kind of summarize it, remind you a little bit about what was going on, what caused all of this. David's army, it was springtime and David's army had taken off to war, which was common. But instead of David going with his army and leading his men, he hung around the palace. Well, there was one night, he couldn't sleep, so he gets out and starts walking the walls around, and lo and behold, he looks over the wall, and this is late at night, this is not in the middle of the day, and he sees a woman taking a bath on the roof. And he's thinking to himself, And he calls the woman. The problem with this is the fact that this was not just any woman. This was one of his most loyal, faithful military servants, Uriah, who the Bible called as one of David's valiant men. A man that has risked his life many times to protect David. And so David sends for her. And she comes to the palace, and next thing you know, she's expecting. But Uriah is not there. Uriah is not the father. David is. And this is the biggest blemish on David's entire career as king of Israel. It was, his biggest blemish for the man, that was after God's own heart. And we know how David, when he found out, tried to cover it up. He got Uriah sent home on leave. So that maybe, he would spend the night with his wife and next say, oh, the baby belongs to Uriah. Try to hide his indiscretion. But Uriah, being a faithful and loyal servant to his men and to David, stayed at the gate and wouldn't go home. Leave his wife. And so he goes back off to the army, but David sends a note with him. Trust the man to carry the note that tells the commander to put Uriah up front so that he will be killed. David plots this man's murder. Takes his wife, tries to get him to cover up David's sin, and when he wouldn't do it, David ends up having him killed. That's about as low as you can go. Would you not say? Now, the Bible don't talk a whole lot about Bathsheba. What her part was all of this. And if you read all of this stuff, and there's everything from David raped her to she was up there trying to lure David. You know what? None of that's in the Bible. If it's not in the Bible, we're not worried about it. Our job is to take a look at the Bible, study the Bible, and see what the Bible says. It's not up to us to fill in the details. We can get into a whole lot of trouble when we start saying, well, I think. Well, no, it's not about I think. It is thus saith the Lord. Amen? Amen. That's where so many people get into trouble. They start reading things in. No, you take God's word for what it is, and what it says is what it says. Nothing more, nothing less. If God wanted us to know all the details, you know what? He would have put them in there. He put in here what we need to know. So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, conjecture, rumors, and everything else. Was Bathsheba innocent in all of this? Nope. Bathsheba could have been like Queen Bathsheba. Remember her? She absolutely refused the king. Now, as a righteous person, as a person trying to do God's will, taking the right step or taking a stand for what is right can be very painful, can it not? In today's world, it could be easily said if she had refused David's advances, she could have been punished. A lot of things, bad things could have happened to her. Who are we more worried about displeasing, God or man? I'll be quite honest with you. When I was in the military, and even certain stations within the fire department, were being a Christian, you stand out. You can get mocked, you can get made fun of, you can be called quite a few names. And this is a great country to live in. And I love the Army, I love the fire department. But there were certain people that absolutely disliked you just because you were Christian, because you would not go along with their unrighteous plans, their evil thoughts. I had a captain absolutely got mad at me. He was going to leave the station and go do some personal errands. And he told me, he said, if the chief calls, tell him I'm in the shower and I'll call him back. I was like, I'm not going to lie to the chief for you. I refused. And you talking about mad. It wasn't long after that where I transferred out because the situation had gotten so bad because I wouldn't lie for him, I wouldn't cover for him. And so there is a price to be paid. If she had refused David, he could very easily beam the king, the final authority in Israel, to make her life miserable, punish her, whatever. So she is not blameless. She could have. It would have been painful, just as it is for us. If some gunman comes in and tells you to deny Jesus Christ or he'll shoot you, yeah, if you refuse to deny Jesus Christ, he's going to shoot you. That's painful. But I would rather displease man than God. We know that David, after Uriah died, David went ahead and married Bathsheba as soon as the mourning was over. And he thought he had gotten away with it. He thought he had got away from his sin. But that's a lesson for all of us. Sin will find you out. You may get away with it in the eyes of mankind, your friends, your neighbor. Your wife might not even know about what had happened. But God knows. God knows. And so God sends a prophet. He sends Nathan to David. And Nathan has this story about this rich man, or this poor man, who had a little lamb that he had bought. He loved and fed and took care of, treated like part of his family. And this rich man who had, bunches and bunches of sheep and everything else, he had a visitor come. Instead of getting one of his sheep out of his pasture, he went and took the poor man's sheep. This made David mad. Y'all remember the story? Made David mad. That man needs to be killed and give back fourfold to the family. And that's when Nathan put the nail in the coffin, sent it home, and looked up at David and said, "You are that man," because of what he had done to Uriah and to Bathsheba. And then he told him, said, the baby would die. And he told him, there would always be a sword in his house and, all of this. But the baby would die. And we know, according to 2 Samuel, that the baby did die. The baby died before the 8th day because the baby was never named. In the Jewish custom, a male child was named on the day of his circumcision, which was the 8th day. So this child was never named. And it is just listed as a child. The child died. But after David confessed and repented, and he took responsibility, he said, I alone have sinned against God. And there's a lot here. We could spend some time right here in David's confession. David confessed. It doesn't talk about Bathsheba, confessing, but we know that did happen, or it's safe to assume that. Because we know that after the baby had passed away, that David and her, they had another child, another son. And that son was Solomon, who eventually became king. And who come through the lineage to Jesus in the lineage. Now, the lesson here for us is, yes, if we make a mistake, even a bad, horrible, nationally known type mistake, God is big enough to forgive us. But there's also understanding that what has to be done is confession, admitting that we're wrong. How many times have you ever seen people, and I have dealt with this quite a bit with other people, admitting they're wrong. I'm not talking about, I had a young man, and I may have told this story. We were at the fire station. We cooked our own meals. He said, I'll cook. He went out there to the grill. We got hamburgers and everything. And he come back in, there was some little old, looked like charcoal briquettes. Yeah, these hamburger patties look like they'd been to the crematorium. And it's like, okay, what happened? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You were cooking them? I don't know what happened. And I looked over at him and says, yeah, I think you just wasn't paying attention and you let it catch fire. He got mad, slammed the door. He never would admit that he was wrong. But in order for us to get our relationship back right with God and to be restored into that relationship, it begins with confessing. I cooked for 18 years in the firehouse. There was a few meals I burnt. There was a couple times it's like, all right, fellas, let's go down to McDonald's. It's on me. I run this one. You know, I'm sorry. Them chicken and dumplings ain't going to make it tonight. But restoration with our relationship with God begins with confession and repentance. Not just saying, I'm sorry, but no, I'm sorry and changing directions. Getting back on the right path. And it is when you get there, God can restore and bless a person. Bathsheba and David were blessed. They were blessed with Solomon. She is listed in Jesus' genealogy, not by name, but enough information there we know who the genealogy is talking about. And as we close this, these names in the genealogy found in Matthew chapter 1 are not just some random names. They are stories. They were real people who had real struggles. Some of them were great people of faith like Rahab. And then there was others that were absolute failures that God himself took out. We know this. But they're all there as a testimony to show us, to teach us. Some of them we need to learn and not make the same type of mistakes they made. And others are there to encourage us and show us how we should live, how we should have faith to surrender our total lives and trust God completely with our lives like Rahab did. And just like Ruth, that we turn away from our entire past and move forward with God, following Him, no matter where He takes us. That young girl, say she was 17, 18 years old when her husband died, because it wasn't uncommon in that time period to be about 14. There's not that many generations past where that was a common age to be married in this country. And so this young woman, everything that she knew, she left behind to follow where God was taking her. And she became blessed. There's a lot of lessons here. And like I say, we could just take these few names here and we could preach for well over a month just on their lives and the marvelous things that God did in their lives. All right, we're going to finish right there. Anybody got any questions, concerns about it?